It was just past 5:45 in the morning when a plain silver sedan rolled slowly through the mist-covered gates of Naval Station Norfolk. The early fog hung thick over the piers, muting the sounds of a base just beginning to stir. Sailors moved like shadows in the distance, their boots echoing faintly against the concrete. For the largest naval base in the United States, it was a surprisingly quiet moment, until the car pulled into a restricted lot and a woman stepped out. She didn't look like much. No uniform, no stars or stripes, just a cocky outfit and a weathered blazer that looked more suited to an office than a warship. The only thing remotely official was the faded civilian badge clipped to her chest. Her name was Eleanor Hartman. At 42, she carried herself with calm authority and sharp eyes that missed nothing, the kind of gaze more accustomed to reading intelligence briefings than being dismissed on a dock. She walked with purpose toward Pier 12, her steps steady, her face unreadable, scanning the pier with the discipline of someone trained to notice everything and say very little. At the security checkpoint, Chief Warrant Officer Don Keller glanced up from his clipboard. 20 years of naval service had made him fast at reading people. This woman didn't look like anyone important. No bars, no rank. Probably another suit from Washington. Contractor, compliance, maybe even an auditor. He didn't bother with pleasantries. ID and authorization, he said flatly. Eleanor held up her badge. Department of Energy, Special Oversight Division. Keller studied it without enthusiasm. We just had Pentagon suits down here last month, he muttered. What's this about? I'm not here for an audit, she replied calmly. I need information on the scheduled movements of the USS Montana. At that, Keller raised an eyebrow. The USS Montana was one of their most heavily armed Ohio-class nuclear submarines. Movements like that weren't public knowledge, not even to most folks in uniform. Around them, a few sailors paused in their routines, casting glances toward the exchange. One of them, young Cocky, leaned against a bollard and smirked. Mem, Keller said as he handed back the badge with a subtle edge of irritation. That's classified information. You'll need to provide something a lot more concrete than that badge. My clearance is encoded, Eleanor said, her voice flat and steady. Everything you need is already in your system. The petty officer near the railing chuckled. Lady, those boats don't surface for paper pushers. If you want a great view of the harbor, I'd recommend the edge of the pier. There was laughter. Not cruel, but smug. The kind of chuckles reserved for outsiders who didn't know their place. Eleanor didn't flinch. She just nodded once, turned, and walked toward the far edge of the pier where the fog clung thickest to the water. Alone now, with her back to the jeering crowd, she stood motionless, not shifting, not checking her watch, just watching the water like she was waiting for something very specific. Inside the base's command center, Commander Julius McClellan furrowed his brow at the sonar screen. Something unexpected was pinging, low frequency but consistent, approaching from the southeast. Run that again, he said. The sonar technician worked quickly. Same result, sir. Unidentified sub, deep water. 15 knots. Coming straight toward the harbor. McClellan straightened. That's not possible. Nothing scheduled from that vector. Check with Sublient. Confirm we don't have any returning assets. The technician's hands flew across the keyboard. Sir. Another officer cut in, her voice tight. It based on trajectory. It's heading straight for Pier 12. On the pier, the surface of the water began to swell. At first, no one noticed. Then, one by one, heads turned as a black shadow pushed upward, massive and silent. Sailors froze mid-step. Chief Keller dropped his coffee. A submarine was surfacing. Right there. No notice. No tugboats. Just rising, silent and deliberate, like it had been called from the deep. The conning tower broke the water, gleaming wet and immense. Every sailor who had mocked the woman just moments earlier now stood dead still, watching. From the hatch, a figure emerged. It was Captain Richard Sawyer, commander of the USS Montana, still in full dress uniform. He stood tall on the platform, his face stern. But he wasn't looking at the base or the dock crew, or even the command tower. His eyes were locked on Eleanor Hartman, standing alone at the edge of the pier, and then he saluted her. Not casually, not politely, a full, formal salute, sharp, unwavering, and deeply respectful. Chief Keller staggered forward in disbelief. Mom, That sub, that's part of the Phantom Fleet. They don't answer to anyone on this base. Eleanor turned, opened her blazer, and revealed what lay beneath the civilian badge. It was a matte black card, no bigger than a credit card, but etched with platinum circuitry and a small red star in its center. "They don't report to you," she said, her voice calm but heavy with weight. "They report to me." For the first time in his long naval career, Chief Keller had no words. He didn't know what Deepwell was. He didn't know what kind of authority that card represented. But in that moment, seeing the submarine, the captain's salute, the silence across the entire pier, he understood one thing very clearly. This woman wasn't a bureaucrat. She was the person the system counted on when all else failed, and she had just surfaced a nuclear submarine with a badge no one understood, and power no one had seen coming. Would you like me to continue with the next segment, covering the moment the command center activates Omega Protocol and the broader threat Eleanor is there to uncover? For several long seconds, no one breathed. The sound of the sea, the distant gulls, the faint creak of mooring lines, all of it faded beneath the heavy weight of disbelief settling across Pier 12. Standing alone at the water's edge, Eleanor Hartman didn't flinch. She didn't move at all. Her hands remained at her sides, eyes fixed calmly on the rising mass of steel that now loomed just yards away from where she stood. The USS Montana, an Ohio-class nuclear submarine, one of the largest, deadliest, and most secretive vessels in the U.S. Navy's arsenal, was surfacing, not at a designated dock, not with tugboats, not in response to orders relayed through the usual command channels. It was rising, for her. Sailors who just moments ago had been laughing behind her back now stood in silence, their faces pale and eyes wide. A few instinctively reached for radios. Others simply stared as the conning tower emerged fully from the sea, water cascading in thick sheets off its smooth hull. No one gave it clearance. No one expected it. And that, more than anything, was what left them shaken. By now, alarms were beginning to trigger across the base. Inside the command center, Commander Julius McClellan barked into a headset, demanding answers. "Is this some sort of drill?" he asked. "Negative, sir," came the reply from sonar. "No scheduled surfacing. No prior authorization." Then what the hell is that sub doing surfacing directly in front of a civilian? Back on the pier, Chief Don Keller was no longer dismissive. His coffee forgotten, the ceramic shards at his feet a stark contrast to the perfect form of the Montana now holding steady in the harbor. No drift, no current adjustment, just silence, as if it had risen in reverence. The top hatch opened with a hiss. All eyes turned. From within, Captain Richard Sawyer appeared. His posture was rigid, his uniform immaculate despite what must have been hours or days beneath the surface. He stepped up onto the platform, the cool morning breeze catching the edge of his jacket. For a moment, he simply stood there, scanning the pier. Then his eyes found Eleanor Hartman, and locked there. With precise, deliberate motion, he raised his right hand in a formal salute. Not just acknowledgement. Deference. It was the kind of salute reserved for a commanding officer of the highest authority. Someone who stood beyond rank, beyond branch. The kind of salute sailors give when they recognize they're no longer in control of the moment. Keller stumbled forward, still trying to process what he was seeing. "Ma'am, that's not protocol. These boats don't just appear like this. They're Black Fleet. The Phantom Group. They don't report to the Navy, not in the usual way." Eleanor turned slowly to face him. Her expression was unchanged, calm, clinical, with just a trace of something older behind her eyes. Fatigue, maybe. Or weight. The kind that comes from carrying something alone for too long. "I'm aware," she said quietly. She reached inside her blazer, past the badge he had scoffed at earlier, and withdrew a small black card. It shimmered in the gray morning light, obsidian black, lined with platinum circuitry. In its center, a single red 5-pointed star. Keller took a step back as if he'd seen something sacred. "I need to contact command," he muttered, already reaching for his radio. But before he could speak, armed personnel began to arrive on the scene. Tactical units, military police, men and women in full response gear, weapons drawn but expressions frozen in uncertainty. Their radios were chattering with overlapping orders, none of which explained what they were looking at. One of the lieutenants raised a rifle halfway, then lowered it again after catching a glimpse of the card in Eleanor's hand. "Is that?" he whispered, trailing off. Keller answered for him. "Omega level identification." Even saying the words seemed to hollow out the air around them. Everyone knew of Omega clearance, or at least they thought they did. A whisper-level protocol, rumored to override even presidential orders in specific, tightly defined scenarios. No one had ever seen it used. Most didn't even believe it was real. Now, here it was, standing on Pier 12 in the hand of a woman who wasn't in uniform, wasn't in any chain of command they understood, but whom the captain of a nuclear submarine had just saluted. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice measured. "Captain Sawyer," she called across the short stretch of water. "Yes, Mom," the man responded instantly, his voice amplified by a throat mic. "Secure the vessel. Begin surface stabilization. We're initiating full verification protocols." "Acknowledged, ma'am." "Securing now." The command was given, and in moments, crew members began appearing from within the Montana, executing orders with the precision of a well-oiled machine. No hesitation, no confusion. Back in the command center, McClellan stared at the live feed on screen, eyes narrowed. "Get me confirmation on that woman's identity now." A young ensign ran in seconds later, breathless. "Commander, we just ran a tier 1 cross check, and she's real. Name is Eleanor Hartman, Department of Energy, Oversight Division." McClellan waved a hand. "We've had oversight types before." The ensign shook her head. "Not like this, sir. She's tagged under something called Deepwell Protocol. The file's locked at compartmental level. We don't even have access clearance." McClellan leaned forward slowly. "Then who does?" "Joint Special Committee. 2 justices, 3 senators, and the Secretary of Defense. That's it." Back outside, the pier had grown quiet again. The Montana's massive bulk lay still in the water, its engines off, its hull gleaming beneath a rising sun. From this angle, it almost didn't seem real, more like a sea creature summoned from the deep, answering a call no one else could hear. Keller approached Eleanor carefully. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. She gave him a faint smile. "You're not the first. You won't be the last. I've been in the Navy 20 years, he added, "and I've never seen anything like that." "You're not supposed to," she replied. "That's the point." He hesitated. "What now?" Eleanor looked back toward the Montana. "Now we find out who tried to take control of that boat from the inside, and whether they were acting alone." Keller blinked. "Wait, you think someone tried to override it?" "I don't think," she said. "I know." As she turned and walked toward the arriving convoy of black SUVs, unmarked, but unmistakably federal, the sailors on the pier didn't laugh, didn't whisper, didn't move. They had seen something they couldn't explain, and it had just saluted. Would you like me to continue with the next section? Unveiling the deeper conspiracy and Eleanor's true mission under Omega Protocol. Chief Warrant Officer Don Keller had seen plenty during his 2 decades in uniform. Shipboard fires, hostile waters, near-miss drills gone wrong. But nothing like this. The USS Montana was still holding its surface position in complete silence, as if waiting for one voice alone to break the stillness. And that voice belonged to the woman he had dismissed not an hour earlier. Eleanor Hartman stood tall, calm as ever, the early sunlight catching the edges of the small obsidian card in her hand. It didn't look like much, no gold eagle, no blue seal, not even a name printed on its surface. Just that dark stone finish, lined with platinum circuitry, and at its center, a crimson 5-pointed star that seemed to pulse faintly under the light. Whatever this card was, everyone on that pair instinctively knew one thing: it outranked every uniform in sight. "You're holding Omega credentials," Keller said at last, almost whispering, as if saying the words too loudly might change everything. "That's correct," Eleanor replied. "Authorization Omega, level black," Keller swallowed. "But that, I thought Omega Protocol was a myth, a Cold War rumor." "It was," she said. "Until it wasn't." As she stepped away from the edge of the pier and approached the group of arriving security officers, Keller and several others instinctively parted. They weren't sure what chain of command she belonged to, but they knew better than to stand in her way now. From the Montana, Captain Richard Sawyer remained atop the conning tower, still watching. He hadn't moved since saluting her. That, too, said something. Nuclear sub-commanders didn't salute civilians, and certainly not with that kind of formality. By the time Eleanor reached the security perimeter, a perimeter now manned by heavily armed Navy personnel, several officers were already radioing Central Command, trying to make sense of the situation. Some were requesting verification of her credentials. Others had given up trying. All eyes stayed on the obsidian card. Commander Julius McClellan was already on the base's secure line with Washington when he received the code verification back. The line went quiet as he listened to the other end. When the call ended, he remained seated for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He finally turned to his deputy and said, "Stand down all alerts at Pier 12, sir? She's not under our authority. She's beyond it." Outside, Eleanor finally addressed the closest security officer, a young lieutenant whose face hadn't quite figured out whether to show awe or confusion. "I need access to your secure comms facility. Priority channel, and bring me Commander McClellan. We'll need a full base lockdown within the hour." "Yes, Mom," the lieutenant managed, gesturing toward the armored vehicles pulling up along the service road. Keller followed her at a slight distance, still unsure if he should speak. After a few seconds, he couldn't help himself. "I've seen top clearance. Presidential briefings. Delta Black. I've never even heard of Deepwell." "You weren't supposed to," Eleanor replied. "That's how it works." He nodded slowly, still processing it. "What exactly is Deepwell?" Eleanor didn't look at him as she answered. "A civilian oversight program, established in 1983, post-Able Archer, the NATO exercise." Keller asked, his voice sharpening with recognition. "The one the Soviets almost mistook for a real nuclear first strike." "Exactly," she said. That was the moment the government realized the chain of command could be both vulnerable and too rigid. So a fallback system was created. Off books, no operational footprint, no public acknowledgement. Just a handful of civilian operatives scattered across the country. Trained, authorized, invisible. Keller stared. "And you're one of them?" "I'm the current primary," she said. "And I've just activated Omega Protocol for the 4th time in 42 years. The statement landed like a weight. He stopped walking. 4 times. That's right. They reached the main communications facility, where a pair of special agents waited to escort her inside. Before entering, Eleanor turned back toward Keller. Her tone softened just a shade. "You believe in the chain of command, Chief. That's good. Most do. That's why we exist." He frowned. "To override it. To catch what falls between the cracks," she corrected. "To step in when the system's either been broken or compromised." Inside, the command center was already buzzing. Commander McClellan met her there, visibly composed but clearly uneasy. "Ms. Hartman," he said stiffly, "we received confirmation from the Joint Committee. Your credentials check out." "They better," Eleanor replied. "We're facing a breach." She wasted no time. A secure briefing was assembled with senior officers from across the base. Once inside, Eleanor connected her card to the encrypted system, revealing a trove of data that even the highest-ranking personnel had never seen. 3 weeks ago, she began. Ore monitoring units detected anomalies in the nuclear fleet's command protocols. Attempts were made to insert alternate command pathways that bypass the authorized launch structure. This was not a drill, and not an accident. The screen lit up with satellite data, communication logs, and tracking graphs. Russian naval movements near Alaska. Chinese fleet drills pushing closer into disputed Pacific waters. "This surfacing," she continued, nodding to the earlier event, "was a test. I issued an Omega signal to the Montana, knowing it had also received alternate countermanding orders from a compromised channel. The sub passed. It responded to Deepwell, not the false command." A heavy silence filled the room. Commander McClellan finally broke it. "You're saying someone tried to hijack our nuclear fleet?" "I'm saying someone succeeded," Eleanor said. "At least partially. We've traced financial flows through shell companies in Singapore. Communications routed through diplomatic backchannels. And 3 admirals currently under surveillance." "And the Montana?" another officer asked. "Why surface here?" "Because I told it to," she said. And because the crew still honors their oath to the Constitution, not just their orders. She turned toward McClellan. What you saw out there today wasn't just a show of force. It was a confirmation that the safeguards built into the system still work, if you know how to activate them. And if someone like you is watching, he said. Exactly. He looked at her differently now, not as a civilian, not even as an authority figure, but as something more difficult to define, a kind of national antibody, buried deep in the bloodstream of defense infrastructure, waiting silently for the moment the infection appeared. As the briefing concluded, Eleanor gathered her tablet and obsidian card. She paused for a moment and addressed the room. I'm going to request a national verification sweep of all nuclear assets, land, sea, air. If anything fails authentication, it gets isolated. No exceptions. McClellan nodded. We'll follow your lead. You won't be alone, she said. Other deep well operators have been activated. This is larger than just Norfolk. Keller, watching from just outside the room, saw the way senior officers deferred to her now, not grudgingly, respectfully. As Eleanor exited, he called after her. Does this mean we're at war? She stopped briefly. Not yet. And then she walked on, leaving behind the echo of something no sailor there would forget, the day a civilian surfaced a nuclear submarine and pulled back the curtain on the last line of defense no one knew existed. Would you like me to continue with the next phase, where the broader conspiracy unfolds and the president is briefed face to face? The briefing room had gone silent after Eleanor Hartman's last statement. Her final slide, still projected on the screen, displayed 3 names. All U.S. Navy admirals, all flagged with active surveillance markers. To the men and women seated before her, experienced officers who had long believed their systems were unshakable. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath their boots. Commander Julius McClellan was the first to speak, though his voice was lower than usual. Are you confirming direct compromise? I am, Eleanor replied. 3 admirals. One of them has already fled U.S. airspace. He boarded a private Gulfstream jet 3 hours ago. His current trajectory puts him en route to Helsinki. He's not defecting. He's being moved. McClellan stared. Russian intelligence. Eleanor gave a slight nod. Our working theory. The rest will let the field teams confirm. She tapped the screen again. A second map appeared. This one showing a layout of Naval Base Kitsap in Washington State. A red marker blinked over the dock where the USS Maine, another Ohio-class submarine, was moored. What you're looking at, she said, is the second stage of the operation. A parallel command node embedded directly inside the chain of command. One of the Montana's sister vessels was outfitted with modified communications hardware. It passed protocol checks, barely, because the injection layer was quantum, since to mimic official channels. A young officer leaned forward. Wu ordered the retrofit. That's the problem, Eleanor said. Nobody we can find. Which means the order came through someone inside the security architecture itself. Someone with the authority to bypass standard inspection chains. Another officer at the back of the room cleared his throat. That kind of access doesn't exist on paper. It does, Eleanor said. Just not in systems you were meant to see. Commander McClellan pushed back from the table, arms crossed. And the Kitsap facility. What's the situation there? One of our embedded Deepwell operatives at Kitsap, Dr. Elaine Thorne, civilian engineer, officially assigned to propulsion systems, activated an emergency lockdown protocol this morning. She detected command mismatches during scheduled updates to the launch sequence controls. Before she was cut off from internal systems, she flagged the anomaly and locked down the sub's launch bay via manual override. You said this was a 2-stage operation, Keller said from the corner, stepping into the room. Eleanor nodded. The first was testing if the fleet would respond to unauthorized channels. The Montana passed because Captain Sawyer recognized the Omega signal. But Kitsap, that's different. She tapped the tablet again. The map zoomed in. Colonel Bruce Lawrence, executive officer aboard the USS Maine, has taken control of the vessel. He's refused to respond to Thorne's override. He's blocked external communications and is now demanding direct negotiations. With me. McClellan's brows drew together. He asked for you by name. He did, she said. He claims he has documentation names. Evidence that the infiltration extends beyond the Navy, possibly into Congress. There was a long pause. You believe him? Keller asked. Eleanor looked down for a moment before answering. I believe he believes what he's seen. That's enough to treat it seriously. Why not just send in SEALs? One officer muttered. Because this isn't about retaking a sub. Eleanor answered firmly. It's about who's behind the orders the crew thought they were following. Deepwell wasn't designed to solve surface-level problems. It was built for exactly this, when the system itself becomes the threat. McClellan leaned forward. Then what's your move? I'm going to Kitsap, she said. Several heads turned. You're walking into a potential mutiny, Keller said quietly. Eleanor looked at him. I'm walking into the last firewall we have before this becomes something no one can pull back from. Lawrence didn't go rogue. He reached out, which means he wants someone to hear the truth. That someone has to be me. 12 hours later, the wind whipped across the pier at Naval Base Kitsap. Thick cloud cover had rolled in, and the waters of the harbor chopped restlessly beneath an iron-gray sky. In the distance, the USS Maine had surfaced, under tight security from Coast Guard cutters and Marine Patrol boats. No one was allowed within 100 yards. A rigid hull boat approached slowly. Aboard it stood Commander Bruce Lawrence. He was younger than Eleanor expected, maybe 35, with the rigid bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime following orders. His posture was tight, his eyes clear but shadowed. He carried a hardened briefcase in one hand and a pistol strapped to his belt in the other. His security team held back as he stepped onto the pier. Eleanor waited alone at the center. Commander Lawrence, she said calmly. I'm Eleanor Hartman, Depot Primary, he said, his voice tight. That's why I asked for you. He walked up slowly and placed the briefcase on a steel bench between them. I'm not here to threaten anyone. But before I surrender command or walk away from this, I need your word, your personal word, that what's in this case gets where it needs to go. All the way. No cover-ups. No back channels. You have it, she said simply. He studied her face, searching for doubt. Then he opened the case. Inside were classified intercepts, copies of encrypted emails, meeting notes from off-the-record sessions, and signatures, 3 U.S. senators, all members of the Senate Intelligence Committee. They weren't working with Russia or China, Lawrence said quietly. They wanted to consolidate control here at home. They said civilian oversight had gotten too fragmented, too diluted, their words. Eleanor didn't look shocked. She just looked tired. They called it a contingency structure. Lawrence continued. For a moment, when elected leaders might hesitate to act decisively in a national crisis, they wanted to preempt that. A shadow government, she said. He nodded. But without civilian accountability. Eleanor closed the case gently. You did the right thing? Commander. I don't know if I did, he said. I've spent my career believing in the chain of command, and now I've just broken it. No, Eleanor said. You reinforced it. You remembered who it's supposed to serve. As he turned himself over to security, Eleanor remained on the pier for a long while, watching the Maine as its systems powered down and its crew disembarked for debriefing. The sub looked the same as any other vessel, quiet, still massive. But today it had carried more than warheads. It had carried a warning. She turned and walked toward her waiting vehicle. The obsidian card with the red star rested inside her jacket, close to her heart, not a symbol of power, but of responsibility. One she carried not for glory, not for recognition, but for the silent assurance that someone, somewhere, would always be watching the watchers. Would you like me to continue with the next scene, where Eleanor briefs the president and the broader scale of the Deepwell activation unfolds? The storm outside Andrews Air Force Base had begun to settle as Eleanor Hartman stepped off the jet. A black government SUV waited on the tarmac, engine humming low under the dim lights. She carried the briefcase herself. No aide, no escort. Just her, the wind, and the weight of the documents inside. Beside the vehicle stood Director Evelyn Harlow of Naval Intelligence, her sharp gray suit pressed immaculate despite the long hours. She nodded once at Eleanor, and together, they climbed inside. He asked for you personally. Harlow said as the SUV pulled away. And no, it wasn't a request. The president? Eleanor asked, though she already knew. Harlow nodded. He's been briefed. In part, not on Deepwell's full scope. Eleanor kept her eyes on the window. The Pentagon loomed closer with every turn, bathed in floodlights and guarded by layers of security most civilians couldn't imagine. And he wants to know what he's dealing with. He wants to know why his own military nearly turned on itself without him even realizing. They didn't speak again until the vehicle reached the underground entrance. Clearance was immediate. The system knew her card, black obsidian, platinum veins, red star, better than it knew most generals. 15 minutes later, Eleanor Hartman stood in a secure conference room inside the Pentagon, directly across from the President of the United States. Several senior advisors flanked him. National Security, Homeland Defense, and at the center one man, whose title made him the commander-in-chief of every soldier, sailor, and nuclear warhead in the country. But right now, he wasn't in charge. Hartman, the president said, rising. I've read the brief, or what parts I'm cleared to see. I'll be honest, I've been in this office for 3 years, and I've never heard of Deepwell until 12 hours ago. That's by design, Mr. President, Eleanor said calmly. Deepwell wasn't created to be visible. It was created to be effective. The president gestured toward a seat. Then it's time I learned what my predecessors kept hidden. Eleanor sat, opened the case, and began. Deepwell was established in 1983 under Executive Directive 1979X. Following 2 incidents that year, a NATO exercise called Able Archer and a launch system failure at Malmstrom Air Force Base, President Reagan authorized the formation of a parallel oversight body, one with no operational authority over conventional forces, but full jurisdiction in one area: nuclear deterrence. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, aged, yellowing slightly under the fluorescent lights. This is the original charter, signed by President Reagan, Vice President Bush, and witnessed by 3 members of the National Security Council. It authorized the creation of a civilian program that could intervene when evidence suggested the military command chain was compromised or subverted. You're saying, the president interrupted, that since 1983, a civilian-run program has had ultimate override over nuclear assets. Not override, Eleanor corrected. Fail-safe. We don't issue orders. We don't launch missiles. But when the command path is broken, or worse, hijacked, our role is to freeze the system, lock it down, verify every link, and restore lawful civilian authority. The defense secretary leaned forward. How many people know about this? Fewer than 40, Eleanor said. Across all branches and agencies, Deepwell operates through layers of compartmentalization. Operators like myself are selected by a bipartisan oversight committee, composed of 2 sitting Supreme Court justices, 3 senior members of Congress, balanced by party, and 2 executive appointees with no direct military affiliation. The president narrowed his eyes. And you answer to them. We answer to the Constitution, Mr. President, she said, her voice still calm. But yes, operationally, we report to that committee, until the moment comes when reporting becomes impossible. Then we act. The room sat in stunned silence. One of the president's advisors cleared his throat. And how often has that happened? 3 times before today, Eleanor said. Today makes 4. She pressed a button on her tablet, and the screen behind her flickered to life. Maps, names, flags, dozens of encrypted records that had been decrypted only hours earlier. The plot we just exposed was not external in origin. It wasn't driven by a foreign state actor looking to strike us from the outside. It was engineered within, by men who believed our systems had become too slow, too fractured, too democratic. The president leaned back in his chair. A coup. They wouldn't have called it that, Eleanor said. They called it a continuity plan, but it was nothing more than a power grab. One designed to consolidate control over launch authority under a pre-cleared, unelected node. 3 admirals, a sitting senator, possibly more. And you caught it, the president said. Because of this program, because Deepwell was watching, she said simply. We monitor the nuclear triad, the command signals, the redundancy systems, and when something doesn't match, when orders come from the right place but with the wrong cadence, we act. The Secretary of Homeland Security rubbed his temple. So let me get this straight. There's a hidden layer to our nuclear infrastructure, and the only thing stopping a false launch or a hijack command is a handful of civilians. Yes, Eleanor said. And no, we don't prevent launches with codes or buttons. We prevent them with truth, with verification, with time. We slow things down long enough for people to make real decisions before irreversible ones are made. The president stood and walked to the screen. Why wasn't I told? Why didn't any of my national security briefings include this? Because no president is briefed on Deepwell unless activation is imminent, Eleanor replied. It keeps politics out. The more visible we become, the easier it is for someone to infiltrate or manipulate the system. And yet here we are, the president said, with 3 admirals detained and a civilian engineer saving the country from a hijacked submarine. He turned back to Eleanor. What happens now? We do what we were designed to do, she said. We sweep every asset. We identify every link that's been corrupted, and we isolate the damage before it spreads. The president looked down for a moment, then met her eyes. You're asking me to trust a system I've never heard of, run by people I've never met. No, sir, Eleanor said. I'm asking you to trust the Constitution and the people who still protect it when no one's watching. That landed. The president nodded slowly. Then do it. Whatever resources you need. Whatever doors you have to open, you have my support. Eleanor gave a single nod. Thank you, Mr. President. You won't regret it. As she stepped out of the conference room minutes later, the corridors of the Pentagon echoed behind her. A storm had been averted, but only just. And far beneath the surface of public awareness, Deepwell had done what it was built to do: intervene quietly, firmly, and without applause. No medals, no announcements, just a black card with a red star, and a promise made in 1983 that no unauthorized finger, foreign or domestic, would ever touch the nuclear button without someone standing silently in the way. Would you like me to continue with the next chapter? The full-scale Deepwell activation and synchronized submarine demonstration across the globe. The order came without hesitation. Do it, the president said, looking directly at Eleanor Hartman. Whatever resources you need, whatever assets you have in place. I want this verified, and I want the world to know that civilian authority still holds. Eleanor gave a firm nod. Then we initiate Broken Arrow. She didn't need to explain. The term had existed in classified doctrine for decades, a coordinated, synchronized maneuver to demonstrate absolute control over the nation's most elusive and powerful nuclear assets, its ballistic missile submarines. The protocol had never been used in its entirety, until now. Within minutes, encrypted signals were dispatched across the globe. From deep beneath the Atlantic to the icy waters near the Aleutians, from the Arctic Drift to the Pacific abyss, submarines bearing names like Tennessee, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Kentucky received the coded command. The orders came not through traditional military channels, but through Deepwell's independent verification network, a shadow line of authority designed to light up only in crisis. Each sub's commander faced a moment of reckoning. Obey a signal most had been trained to believe was theoretical, or risk disobeying what they thought was protocol. They chose the former. At precisely 0800 Eastern Time, the world's oceans stirred. Massive swells rolled outward across waters once still. Black holes broke the surface like leviathans summoned from myth. One after another, 14 Ohio-class submarines breached in near-perfect synchronization. No tugs, no support vessels, no announcement, just a silent global display of unity, a message to adversaries and allies alike. Civilian oversight had not only survived, it had prevailed. In the Situation Room beneath the White House, the satellite feed lit up with green indicators, each marking a successful surfacing. The president stood before the screens, watching in reverent silence. How long will they remain surfaced? He asked. Exactly 90 seconds, Eleanor replied. Long enough for every nation watching those satellites to understand what it means. Then they'll disappear again. And if someone tries to spoof the data? The Secretary of Defense asked. They can't, Eleanor said. The quantum handshake protocol is unforgeable. That was part of the reason Deepwell was established. To build a system even the Joint Chiefs couldn't backdoor if compromised. He didn't ask how she knew that. No one in the room did anymore. As the clock ticked past the 90-second mark, the submarines began to vanish once more beneath the waves, as silently as they had come. Only their wakes remained, churning slowly outward like ghost trails on a glassy surface. But the visual confirmation was only part of the story. Across the verification grid, deep-well operators reported results in real time. USS Tennessee cleared. USS Henry M. Jackson green status. USS Alabama secured. But then yellow warnings began to appear. And soon after red. Minot Air Force Base. Delayed handshake. Operator override initiated. Whiteman AFB. Resistance from internal systems. Possible counter-authorization detected. And then it came. 17 officers across the nuclear command structure had failed authentication. 4 generals, 3 admirals, 10 line-level officers, all of them with direct access to nuclear deployment protocols. The president exhaled. How deep does this go? We don't know yet, Eleanor said, but we're closing the gaps. Director Harlow entered the room with new intel. We've secured 8 of the targets. 3 are in custody at secure sites. 2 have fled. We're tracking them through diplomatic channels. 4 are resisting detainment. And Kitsap? The president asked, already knowing the answer before she responded. Kitsap remains volatile, Eleanor said. Commander Lawrence has locked himself inside the USS Maine. He's refused to acknowledge Central Command but asked for a direct conversation. With who? The president asked. With me. The room went silent. The defense secretary was the first to object. We can't allow that. He's holding a submarine hostage. No, Eleanor said. He's holding a mirror up to the system. And if what he claims is true, there's more at stake than just one submarine. I've seen your file, the president said. You've handled worse. I've never handled something this close to home, she admitted. But I can read a man's intent. And Lawrence isn't a traitor. He's a whistleblower caught in a web. The president nodded once. Then go. Take what you need. But end this. 6 hours later, Eleanor Hartman stood again at a windswept pier, this time in Washington state. Naval base Kitsap lay before her, bristling with layered security. Black Coast Guard boats circled offshore. Marine snipers kept watch from rooftop perches. And in the center of it all, moored like a sleeping titan, was the USS Maine. A launch boat approached. On it stood Commander Bruce Lawrence. He was unshaven, hollow-eyed, but clear-headed. As he stepped onto the pier, Eleanor met him without guards, without weapons. You're taking a risk coming here alone, he said. I'm not here to arrest you, she replied. I'm here to listen. He handed her a small, secure drive. Inside were documents, communications, signed memos, 3 senators, 1 defense contractor. A chain of encrypted orders designed to create a failover launch path, one not recognized by either the Pentagon or Deepwell. They weren't working for Russia, Lawrence said. They weren't foreign agents. They were trying to centralize control, create a clean chain of command they could count on if elected leaders ever hesitated. Eleanor opened the drive. Names flickered across the screen. Some she knew, some she didn't. But all of them, if verified, would shake the country's foundations. You did the right thing, Commander, she said. He didn't answer right away. I broke my oath to follow orders. No, Eleanor replied. You honored your oath to defend the Constitution. He finally looked her in the eye. So what happens now? We purge the system, she said quietly. Thoroughly, and with no room for error, as they walked back toward the command post, the Maine remained docked behind them, a vessel that had narrowly escaped becoming the tip of a political weapon. Eleanor turned once more to face the boat. She didn't salute. She didn't speak. But in that moment, she made a silent vow that whatever shadows remained in the system would be dragged into the light, even if she had to pull them herself. Back at Deepwell Command, one last red indicator on the network map began to turn green, not because the system had fixed itself, but because someone had insisted on looking when no one else wanted to see. Would you like me to continue with the final chapters, the public reckoning, the fate of those involved, and Eleanor's quiet return to the shadows? The headlines never told the full story. Some mentioned unusual fleet activity in global waters. Others alluded to a high-level security review of strategic assets, but nowhere in the news cycle, not on CNN, not in congressional transcripts, did the name Deepwell ever appear. And that was by design. In Washington, 3 sitting senators were quietly removed from the Senate Intelligence Committee. No press conference, no televised hearings, just a single sentence in the official congressional record: appointments to the Committee on Intelligence have been revised per internal review. Behind closed doors, subpoenas were issued, staffers questioned, travel logs scrutinized, offshore accounts frozen. What had begun as a ripple, one commander's refusal to accept a suspicious order, had become a wave that swept through the highest echelons of government. 2 Navy admirals were placed under indefinite suspension. A third had already fled and was now in federal custody, retrieved from a diplomatic safe house in Helsinki by Finnish special operations and handed over under the kind of agreement that never sees daylight. But for Eleanor Hartman, the public headlines were irrelevant. She wasn't here for the cameras. She never had been. 72 hours after Broken Arrow was executed, she was back at Naval Station Norfolk. No red carpet, no ceremony, just fog over the bay and the low rumble of supply trucks moving through the docks. The same pier where the USS Montana had surfaced now looked ordinary again. Painted lines, crows nesting in the light towers, sailors moving equipment without glancing up. But those who had seen what happened days ago now moved differently. Not out of fear, but reverence. Eleanor hadn't raised her voice, hadn't thrown her weight around. And yet a nuclear submarine had answered her call. It was something no one could forget. Chief Warrant Officer Don Keller stood near the security checkpoint, his posture straighter than usual. When he saw her approach, he stepped aside instinctively. "Welcome back, ma'am." Eleanor gave him a quiet nod. "You heading to the comms building?" "I just came to walk the pier," she said. "One last time before I disappear again." He hesitated. "Is it really over?" She paused. "The crisis is over. The cleanup isn't." "I heard 3 senators," he said. "And you didn't hear wrong," she replied. "Their names won't be made public. There won't be trials. But they won't hold security clearances again." He looked out at the water. "I used to believe the chain of command was the one thing in the world that couldn't break." "It didn't break," Eleanor said. "It cracked. That's what Deepwell is for." He nodded thoughtfully. "You going back into the dark?" "That's where I belong." They stood in silence for a moment, the ocean wind pressing their uniforms against their frames. "It's strange," Keller finally said. "You show up, everything explodes, and now it's like none of it ever happened." "That's the point," Eleanor said. "We're not supposed to leave footprints." But even as she spoke the words, the truth was, this time had been different. Deepwell had been forced into daylight, not fully, not publicly, but enough that new protocols were being drafted. A secure fail-safe now ran parallel to the president's daily briefing. Additional biometric verification procedures were added to every nuclear launch platform. And for the first time in decades, the nation had taken a hard look at the question few dared ask: what happens when the trusted system becomes the threat? Back in the operations center, Eleanor uploaded her final report. She encrypted it, sealed it behind a biometric gate that only Deepwell operators and oversight committee members could access. The contents included her assessments, mission breakdowns, and her formal request to deactivate Omega Authority, until such a time it might be required again. When she finished, she removed her ID badge and placed it neatly beside the keyboard. Not the civilian one, the other. The obsidian card with the platinum veins and red star. It sat there in the soft light, a silent symbol of the extraordinary authority she had exercised. A kind of power so immense, it could never be used lightly. Power that didn't shout or flash, but waited. She reached for it one last time, slipping it back into the inner lining of her jacket. Then she stood, straightened her shoulders, and walked out without saying a word. Outside, the sky was clearing. The morning sun was finally burning off the fog, revealing ships at dock and sailors beginning their day, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. As she passed through the base gates, a young recruit stood watch. He was too new to know who she was, but Keller, now standing at the perimeter, gave her a subtle nod. She nodded back, Then she stepped into a waiting sedan, unmarked, silent, and was gone. Back at the pier, Keller watched the vehicle fade into traffic. Another officer walked up beside him. "Who was that?" the younger man asked. Keller didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "Someone who doesn't exist. Unless everything goes wrong." Back at the Pentagon, members of the Oversight Committee convened in a sealed chamber. Eleanor's report had already arrived. Most of them would never meet her. Some had only heard her name for the first time that week. But every single one of them understood this much. The system had survived because of a ghost, a civilian guardian with no uniform, no command staff, no public office. Just a badge no one recognized, and a card no one dared question. Later that evening, in her small home just outside Richmond, Virginia, Eleanor sat on her porch, a cup of black coffee in hand. The birds were louder than the city. She liked it that way. The world had kept spinning. Most Americans would never know how close they'd come to losing control of their most powerful weapons. But that, too, was the point. There were no medals for what she'd done, no citations, no speeches. Only the knowledge that a silent system still worked, because someone had stood up when it mattered most. She reached into her jacket, pulled out the obsidian card, and stared at it for a long moment. Then she tucked it away again. There would be no fanfare, no headlines, just readiness, in case the shadows ever returned. "Would you like me to continue with the closing message?" Eleanor's final reflection and the deeper meaning of invisible guardianship. Long after the secure doors closed, after the final report was encrypted and sealed away in a vault most people never knew existed, Eleanor Hartman sat in the quiet stillness of her front porch. The world outside looked ordinary again. Birds circled lazily over a sleepy Virginia skyline, and somewhere off in the distance, a neighbor's dog barked at nothing in particular. She sipped her coffee, black, no sugar, and listened, to silence, to normal. It had been a long time since she'd had either. Inside, on a table beside a modest bookshelf, rested two things: a plain brown file folder labeled only with a date, and a small obsidian card, its platinum circuit lines catching the last of the sunset. The red star at its center didn't shine, didn't glow, but somehow it always drew the eye. That card had surfaced a submarine. That card had frozen generals in their tracks. That card had stopped a coup in progress without firing a single shot. But no one would ever read about it in a history book, and that was exactly how it was meant to be. Deepwell was never built for public recognition. It didn't operate through announcements, press conferences, or presidential briefings. It existed outside of that, a parallel track, silent, civilian, and legally authorized to act when every other safeguard had failed. It was quite literally the last line of defense, and Eleanor Hartman was its face, or rather its shadow. Established in 1983, after a series of near-catastrophic Cold War miscalculations, Deepwell had one mission: ensure that America's nuclear weapons could never be misused. Not by a foreign adversary, not by a rogue general, not even by a panicked administration. It was a safety valve in human form, a backstop designed for the moment when the system lost its mind and needed someone who hadn't. Eleanor had known all of this when she was selected. The psychological screening had been exhaustive, the simulations brutal. The background vetting had gone back 3 generations. What mattered wasn't power or rank or ambition. What mattered was restraint and the ability to stay invisible. She had signed no public oath. No camera had ever recorded her training. Even her official file inside the Department of Energy listed her as an analytical liaison. But when things unraveled, when encrypted commands began to flow through corrupted channels and officers followed orders not from the president, but from hidden hands, she had stepped into the light, not to take over, not to be saluted, but to stop the bleeding before it reached the bone. And she had done it without ever raising her voice. Now, as the wind stirred the leaves on the trees outside, she thought of those moments: the surfacing of the Montana, the fear in Commander Lawrence's voice, the stillness of the Situation Room as 14 submarines rose in silent obedience. The resistance, the truth, and the tremor that ran through the chain of command when they realized that someone had been watching all along. That someone wasn't a general, wasn't a politician, wasn't even in the same building. But when it mattered most, that someone had spoken, and the system had listened. That was the real power of Deepwell. Not domination, not control. Correction. A final no in a room full of dangerous yeases. Eleanor stood and stepped inside, closing the screen door behind her. On her desk, her laptop sat in sleep mode, the cursor blinking faintly. Her final message to the committee had already been sent. No fanfare, no language of triumph. Just a simple update: Omega Protocol successfully deactivated. Compromised elements neutralized. System integrity verified. Deepwell primary now offline unless reactivated. She clicked the screen off, picked up the obsidian card, and slipped it into a soft cloth pouch before placing it inside a small steel lockbox. No lock was required. No label was affixed. The card wasn't meant to be seen again unless the world came unglued, and if it did, someone else would come. Another face in the shadows. Another quiet voice trained to say just enough, just once, at the moment it counted. Because that was the essence of Deepwell, not permanent authority, but conditional trust, bound by secrecy, grounded in duty, and always one step outside the spotlight. The president had said it best, as she'd departed the White House 3 days earlier. People like you protect the idea of this country, even when it forgets itself. She hadn't answered. She didn't need to. And now, here at home, as the country settled back into routine, Eleanor knew the job had never really been hers to own. It had been a loan, a burden carried quietly, passed down from those before her and handed forward only when the unthinkable returned. She glanced out the window one last time. A pair of kids were riding bicycles down the street. Somewhere a lawnmower buzzed. Life had resumed. Peacefully. Blindly. Blessedly. And that was the point. They didn't need to know what nearly happened. They only needed to know it hadn't. Because somewhere, someone they would never meet had made sure of it. Eleanor took one final look at the locked box and whispered under her breath, "Let's hope it stays closed for good." She turned out the light, stepped into the soft night air, and disappeared into the quiet, just as she had always intended. No medals, no history books, just the shield behind the sword, the last quiet line, the silent hand that steadied the world and then let it go. Would you like me to now craft a heartfelt life lesson from this story for your viewers, along with a compelling call to comment and subscribe? Sometimes, the ones who save everything don't wear a uniform, they don't stand at a podium, and they don't ask to be thanked. They wait in silence. They watch when no one's watching, and when the system begins to break, they step forward, not for glory, but because someone must. Eleanor Hartman's story reminds us that real strength isn't loud. It doesn't need attention. It doesn't chase applause. It acts when it matters and disappears when the job is done. In life, there are people like her all around us. A quiet neighbor who checks on the widowed veteran down the street. A retired nurse who volunteers at the VA, no one ever noticing. A grandfather who raised a family, held it together through loss, and never once asked for credit. These are the Deepwell people in our lives. The ones who carry unseen burdens, who guard the good quietly, who keep the world from unraveling, even if no one ever knows their name. So today I ask you, who is the Eleanor Hartman in your life? Who is the quiet guardian you've never truly thanked? Tell us in the comments. Let their story be heard, even if they never asked it to be. And if you believe these kinds of stories deserve to be remembered, not for fame, but for meaning, then please like this video, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to our channel so we can keep telling stories that honor those who serve in silence. Because sometimes the loudest legacy is the one whispered from the shadows.